Welcome back to the shop and to the channel. You might recall from a previous video that I picked up this Troyke 9-inch rotary table at auction. I currently have an 8-inch rotary table, but the 9-inch, obviously besides being an inch larger in diameter, I can also use this one in the vertical aspect ratio, which is definitely a big improvement over the one that I have now. Now the table looks like it has a little bit of surface rust on it, but the rest of it looks fairly clean aside from being completely covered in probably dusty oil, oily dust. And my goal for today really is to disassemble this, make sure everything looks the way I think it should look, give it a good clean, and then put it back together. Well, the first thing I want to do is pop off these table slot keys. There's these 6 socketed cap screws that hold this plate on to the bottom of the rotary table, and this is probably a little premature. I could have waited to take this off, but this is kind of part of what holds the table, the actual rotating table, to the base. But I have to take this plate off first before I can get to a couple of other pieces. Now with that plate off, you can see some of the other bits here. There's these 2 screws here that hold the tapered collar in place. They're punch marked, but those punches don't line up. So somebody's definitely been in here before me, because I don't believe that these would loosen up on their own. Now these screws here hold in this tapered collar. You can kind of make it out here. It's split, and the tighter you drive this taper in, the tighter the table is when it's turning. So this kind of sets that, it's not really backlash, I'm not sure what you would call that, the tension on the table for when you're rotating it. And I'm sure I'm using all the wrong terms here, but this was premature anyway. I really didn't need to take this off just yet, because I need to take the handle off with the worm in it before I can take the table off. So I'll try to get some more of this disassembled here by removing the screw that holds the crank handle on. Underneath all this crud, there's some graduations on this collar. Well, there's a roll pin in part of this that's holding on that front piece, and this middle section looks like it's threaded on maybe, but again, I think I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. I really don't need to do this just now, so let me think about this for a minute. I'll take some of these other bits apart. While I'm contemplating what to do for the crank handle, I might as well go ahead and take out this thumb screw that holds on this little pointer for the graduations around the table. There's this long threaded T-handle here, which is the table clamp. Well, on the flat side here for the vertical orientation, there's a plug here, and this plug covers up some adjustment screws for setting the backlash of the worm drive. I don't fully understand how this will come apart. None of the parts diagrams I was able to locate have this particular style of backlash adjustment. illustrated, so this again might take a little bit of work to figure out. In the meantime, I can remove this screw here that is the pivot arm for the handle. Again, this pivots to set the backlash or to disengage the worm drive completely. Well, with that worm drive a little more loose or disengaged, if I tilt this back up on its side, I should be able to pull out that tapered collar, and I'm hoping that I should be able to lift the table off now. Well, the table's got some weight to it, so that's good, but as I was lifting it off, this little piece here, which is part of the table clamp, came out of its spot, and I think this is going to be a real pain in the neck to put back together. I'm going to have to think about how I'm going to get that back in there. Well, there's also a couple of set screws that are visible through this plug, and I believe they're there to set the minimum backlash between the crank worm and the worm drive on the table. Now there's also what looks to be the end of the shaft here that goes through the table. I'm not exactly sure again how this would come apart. I can't really screw it in anymore. It doesn't come out this way, so I need to take a few of these internals apart before I can get the shaft out, and I can't take the crank handle out until I get this shaft out. So it looks like there's this thinner shaft that goes up through the pivoting arm for the backlash adjustment, and it's threaded, and it threads into the knob that you can see up at the top, and that knob is what's used to adjust that backlash and also to disengage the worm. And it looks like there's a jam nut on the end of that rod, and I need to take this nut off in order to back out that knob. Well, I can already tell this is going to be a little bit of fun to put back together. I can only unscrew that center shaft so far before it bottoms out. And then the knob, I can only unthread it so far. So, because it's going to pull that shaft back in. So I think I kind of need to do both of these at the same time, sort of unscrewing the little shaft while backing out the knob, maybe. There we go. My goodness. Well, it was interesting to say the least. So with this knob out, now see what I can do to get the rest of this shaft out of here. Well, it looks like this shaft is actually two pieces. There's the thinner inner shaft, which is threaded, and then I think this larger bit is just a sleeve. And I think that sleeve is just held on there with the roll pin. I assume that's to keep it from being able to be backed out. That's got to come off of there. Well, I can't really knock out this roll pin with that shaft just flipping around in there, so I ended up screwing the knob back into the casting and then screwing the shaft back into it, and that gives me a little bit of stability here that I can knock this roll pin out. Well, this is just some incredibly tight quarters, and I'm really concerned about bending the shaft. Well, I have it out most of the way. I should be able to grab it with some pliers and get it out the rest of the way. Well, I should be able to remove this knob again for the last time. What I find to be the case with just about anything that's had a cross hole drilled through it is that there's always some kind of a burr that keeps them from coming apart nicely. And I'm pretty sure that's the exact same thing we've got going on here. And the only real way that I can get this sleeve off of the shaft is to use a punch on the very cross hole that probably has the burr. Okay, now with that sleeve off of there, it should slide through this casting that the crank handle is on once I get it kind of lined up with the plug hole in the bottom or the side, whatever orientation you want that to be. Well, with that shaft now out of the way, this casting here for the pivot arm, whatever you want to call it, will come out. Well, I haven't decided if I'm going to paint this thing yet because I don't know what it looks like underneath all of the crud, but just in case I do paint it, I do want to pull this oil tube out. Well, now I can turn my attention to disassembling this worm drive. The first thing is this hub, I'm going to call it, that the crank handle keys into. There's a roll pin that holds it in place, of course, with a cross-drilled hole. So I should be able to knock out the roll pin with a punch. Once again, as seems to be the case with a cross-drilled hole, this thing doesn't want to budge. There's probably a burr in there. I don't have any reamers or anything that I can use to potentially try to clean out that hole. I'm not sure it would do any good, so I might need to get a little creative here. Well, the first thing I'll try here is just using a screwdriver as a wedge between the lock nut and this hub, and it gets me at least a little closer. Well, maybe a brass punch will help. Again, I'm trying to be a little cautious here because what I don't want to do is bend the shaft here that goes down the middle of this thing. Well, if I unscrew the nut a little bit, that kind of closes that gap and gives me another opportunity to use the screwdriver as a wedge. Again, need to be careful here. I don't want to damage these threads either. Well, I have it clamped into my vise here with some rubber soft jaws. If I put a wrench in here behind this hub, I can hit the wrench and maybe that'll drive that hub off of there. It's a really tight fit, tighter than I would have thought it would be. Well, that got me a little bit further, but it's got like maybe a quarter of an inch left to go, if that, and it's just not budging. And I don't really want to wail in this thing any more than I already have. Well, then it kind of dawned on me that I have an arbor press, and I think I've separated this enough from the lock nut that I should be able to press it out the rest of the way. With the hub now off the end of the shaft, I can back off this lock nut. This is just to set end play, and the shaft with the worm drive should come out the back. Well, that's everything disassembled as far as I'm going to take it. I'm not going to take the worm off the table. I think it's just fine. There's no reason to remove it. So now I just need to get all of this cleaned up. I don't know if I'm going to repaint it. We'll find out after I get it cleaned. Well, it took a little bit of time and a little bit of super clean, but I managed to get everything nice and clean. I will say this super clean is a pretty decent product. Although I'm not 100% sure that it's safe on all paints or if this thing's been repainted, but it almost looks like it took off some of the color. I did think about painting all this again, but I thought that the paint was actually in good enough shape that it really would have been just a waste of time. I do like the tools and machines in my shop to look nice, and often, I would paint something versus not painting it. However, in this case, I'm not really doing a rebuild. It turns out that this thing is in great shape. I don't need to make any new parts. There really wasn't any wear in it. So I just kind of felt I'm going to leave it the way it is. I may have to come back and adjust this lock nut later. This really just removes the end play on this crank handle, the worm. And now that I have all the burrs removed from this hub here, it goes on a heck of a lot easier. I just need to fix it in place, line it up with the hole in the shaft, and drive in this roll pin. Couple things to note here that may not have been obvious when I was disassembling this thing. Here I'm reinserting the set screw that sets the minimum backlash between the worm gear and the drive. This so you can't really crank it down. The other thing you'll notice is there's that hole. That's where that shaft went through that allows you to disengage the worm. And once I get it all together, I'll put this second set screw in there to lock the first one in place. Well, now I can install this screw here, which is what this crank handle actually pivots around. And I don't want to make this too tight, because if I make it too tight, then it won't pivot. But if it's too loose, it'll just be a little bit sloppy, and we don't want that either. So I've got to find that sort of happy medium. And here I went a little bit too far, I think. So I need to back off on this just a touch. And now to make sure that screw doesn't move, I've got a set screw here. There's already a brass shoe down at the bottom of this hole that is pushing against the threads of that bolt. And I just need to tighten this down real good to ensure that that bolt can't back off on its own. Now getting this mechanism here that allows me to disengage the worm from the table. This has been probably the second trickiest thing I've had to do. Well, maybe the first. But because I've got a combination of left and right hand threads, I've got internal and external threading, there's a jam nut involved. Getting this aligned and at the right setting or point was really quite the challenge. And I actually relied on photographs that I took during the disassembly to help me figure out just how this thing needs to go back together. What I'm trying to do here is get this jam nut so it's in the exact same position before I took this apart, meaning that the same number of threads are exposed when it's tightened down. Well, that matches the way it did before I took it out, although I have the feeling I may have bent the shaft when trying to take out the roll pin. You can see some wobble in it, but it's not really going to affect it too much on operating that pivot. You can see the worm moving away here. Just a little unfortunate that I wasn't able to get this apart and put it back together without damaging it, even though it's kind of inconsequential. But I'm going to leave it in the fully disengaged location for now so I can get the table in next. Well, this is part of the table lock mechanism, and yeah, this is going to be a little tricky to get in the right position. So somehow I need to get this table down inside of here with this clamp thing on top of the worm wheel, but then it has to fall into the bore into the base. I'm not sure how I'm going to be able to do that if I can't see it. I'm wondering if I can't hold it there above the worm and see if I can't maneuver it into place and get it to drop down inside that bore while holding onto it. This table isn't very light. It's not very heavy either, but it's a bit tricky. Well, I guess I'm bleeding now, so yeah, we're making progress. Well, I'm positive this has to go this way because as you thread in this handle, that little wedge pushes down on this component, which then grabs the worm wheel. There's just no other way that this will work. Well, I'll bring the camera down here at a slightly different vantage point. Maybe this will help illustrate what I'm trying to accomplish here. Well, I have that clamp on top of the worm wheel. So now I just need to finagle that shaft so it slides down into the bore into the base. Well, I think that clamp certainly fell down into the bore. So let me thread in this handle and see if it doesn't at least apply some pressure on the table. Well, I think it's in the right place. I'm going to lift up on the table a little bit. Yeah, that clamp is coming up with the worm wheel. So I'm pretty confident it's where it's supposed to be. Well, with this clamped, at least, sort of, I need to flip this upside down now so I can finish assembling this thing to the base. I'll drop in this tapered collar first. Well, it's doubtful that these two screws that hold this in place were drilled in a location that's symmetrical, so I'll turn this around the other way. Yeah, I think that lines up a little bit better than where I started. Now these two screws essentially set the depth of this collar. The further I drive it toward the table, the tighter it will become and the more tension it will put on the rotation of the table. So I don't want to drive these screws in too deep because then I won't be able to turn the table at all. Well, I would imagine those punch marks we saw when I was taking this thing apart probably played some role in defining where I should screw these in. But since I did not keep these screws separated as far as which one went where, and since those punch marks were not lined up anyway, hindsight being 2020, I probably should have made new punch marks to identify which screw went where, but I think we'll just do this by feel until we get it at the right depth. With the tapered collar in the right spot, now I can install this base plate. Well, this last hole wasn't cooperating here, so I will clean up those threads with a tap. Well, I can come back here now and get this locking collar, this lock nut, in the right position. It just removes the end play in the shaft. And with that in the right spot, I can crank down on these set screws to keep it from moving. Well, next is the graduated collar and the lock screw for it. I'll put the hand wheel on next and then attach it to the end of the shaft with a screw. I'm going to run a tap here through this hole to clean out these threads for the pointer for the table graduations. Well, I'll go ahead and reinstall the Gits cup for the worm. I didn't really need to remove this since I didn't paint it, but it certainly did make it a lot easier to clean it with this not in my way. I'll go ahead and put a little lubricating oil down into these oil holes before I secure the caps back on. Well, with the backlash on the worm properly adjusted, I can go ahead and install the locking set screw to keep that longer one from backing out, and then reinstall the plug on the base. Well, these keys fit perfectly in the slots on the Bridgeport, and since 95% of the time I'm using it, that's where it'll be. I'll go ahead and reinstall these now. We'll just leave them installed, and if I ever have to move this over to the K&T, which has slightly larger slots in it, I'll have to make some new keys, but I'll cross that bridge when I come to it. Well, I think that's everything now put back together. The hand wheel turns this really nice and smoothly. There's not a whole lot of backlash whatsoever on this wheel once it's adjusted. I can disengage the worm entirely with this knob on the left. And with that disengaged, the table does rotate. There's some, resistance, I'll call it, but that's not a bad thing, I think, in this situation. It needs to be able to turn, but not loosely. Well, to re-engage the worm is actually pretty simple. You just turn the knob here on the left clockwise while moving the hand wheel back and forth until the gear teeth on the worm and the worm wheel are fully meshed. Well, it might not seem like going from 8 inches to 9 inches on a rotary table is that big of a deal, but you can see that there is a considerable size difference between these two pieces of tooling, and I do feel like the 9-inch is more appropriate. I think maybe a 10-inch would be perfect, but I think the 9-inch is definitely more appropriate than the 8-inch. So now I just need to move the chuck from the 8-inch table over to the 9-inch table. Well, I am going to enjoy using this Troyke 9-inch table, especially the fact that it will go into a vertical orientation as well as horizontal. I think it's a much more useful piece of tooling than the John B. Stevens 8-inch, which is still an excellent piece of tooling. I just think for my uses, this Troyke 9 is a better option. Well, I hope you liked the video. Give it a thumbs up if you did. Drop a comment down below. Let me know what you think. Do you think 9-inch is the wrong size? Should I have stuck with the 12, or should I look for a 10? Well, if you're a subscriber, I thank you. If you're not, consider hitting that subscribe button. And a special thanks to all those that contribute financially to the channel through PayPal or Patreon. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.